It's not like we're telling people to do, if I give advice to anybody, it's always something, it's what the church teaches. I'm not giving people my advice, Father Ryan's advice. I think it's just like, if somebody asks me a question, I'll lay out what the church teaches. Well, this is what the church teaches in this situation, and this is what you probably should do. So, but again, if they don't like it, they tend to do their own thing. So I've got lots of specific examples, but I'm not going to bring them up because they're parishioners of St. Joe and they'll know I'm talking about them. So. We talk a lot about, there's been a lot of talk about our Chesterton Academy of Bowling Green that we may start. And I had a mother talk to me the other day, and she was like, Father, are the kids going to go to school or they'll go to school? Are they going to go to church every day? They have Mass every day. And I said, yeah, that's part of the program. And she says, well, my son gets bored at Mass, and I don't know that he could do it, every single day. And I said, well, it's going to be, part of the curriculum is to go to Mass every day. And of course, she repeated what she said. And I says, well, I'm sure he doesn't want to go to school every day. And I'm sure he's bored at school, but you make him go to school every day. And she was like, oh, well, yeah. And people sometimes, I think, they will comment. They will say things like, well, Mass can be somewhat boring because, we're doing the same things over and over. We're really not. The prayers are always different. The music's always different. Homily generally is usually different. So there's a lot going on. And I always say the same thing. My job, the church's job, is not to entertain us. We've been caught up into this culture of I've got to be entertained all the time. And if you don't entertain me, then I don't want to be a part of it. And especially with social media and our phones, we can be constantly entertained. And but that's the wonderful thing about the Mass is it's not an opportunity to be entertained. It's an opportunity to worship God. He created the entire world just for us, and that He's allowed us to be a part of it, and that we owe Him everything for that. And just an hour a week's all He's asking for. It's literally all He asks for is an hour a week. Come, and because again, the things that we value most, we're going to worship. That's we hear this all the time. What does worship mean? Worthship. What is the most worthy thing in my life? And so on Sundays, we come to Mass. Of course, you can come every day, but we come to Mass and we give due praise to God for all the many blessings. Everything we have is grace. Go back to the story of the prodigal son. The son has nothing except for what the Father gives him. So we come back on Sundays to worship God, to give thanks. And yeah, maybe that's not the most exciting thing in the world. It's not like playing golf or watching a movie or something like that. But it's the most valuable thing that we'll ever do with our time every single week. So,
one of my friends the other day is, I don't know what they are now, atheist, agnostic, something, but they asked for a Bible. They'd start talking to somebody and talk about poetry and things. So I brought them a Bible, and the question that they said, well, what translation should I get? And I said, well, there's all sorts of different translations and things. And I said, I'll just bring you something that's kind of American English and be easy to kind of break yourself into to understand, get something a little bit out of it. But we started to talk about some Protestant religions and things, and she was asking about, King James Version versus Catholic, et cetera, different things. And I said, well, there's this separation that takes place, like when we exclude the sacrifice with liturgy from Scripture, and so Christianity comes from the Jewish people, and so they celebrate service, liturgy of the Word. They have Scripture that's read, and then they have the Paschal kind of Passover sacrifice, whether it be the lamb in the temple, whatever. But there's this both and thing that has to take place. And so in our kind of mainstream Protestant American culture, we've split where we just focus on sola scriptura and just the scriptures, and we exclude the liturgy of the Eucharist. And so you might have a Baptist Methodist church or something that has communion, whatever they call that, and they do that once a month, once a quarter, whatever. And they've separated these two, and so it's an emphasis on the Word, but when the Word doesn't lead us into the Eucharist, then the Word doesn't exist for it. It's not finding its end goal. It doesn't lead us to a close relationship with Christ. It gets there, and then it's just like we hit a wall almost, because it's supposed to always lead us into that. And so when people come to Mass and they say, I'm bored and things, it's a whole drama, and it's the story of God calling us to Himself. But we start off with something from the Old Testament about how humanity's turned away from God. We move then into the New Testament with St. Paul saying, like, you stupid Galatians or something, like, shape it up a little bit. And then story about Jesus, about something that he's done. And then we encounter him in his body and his blood. And so that kind of connection that we have to have the Word and the Eucharist tied together with that. But so many people, they separate that and they only want one. And so even like doing like a Bible study or something and just kind of like saying, I'm only going to focus on the scriptures. Well, yes, but is that leading you to an encounter with Christ in the sacrament of the church? And so the church for a long time didn't really kind of permit the Bible to be translated into vernacular or to be in the hands of people, because there's that connection that has to take place. It's the Word serves the Eucharist, but that comes from our Jewish roots. And so many people coming from that entertainment kind of background and thing, or even just a Protestant background, they are so used to having the Word, but forgetting that it has to lead into something else, which is ultimately it's intimacy with God. It's receiving Him, where God Himself comes into our bodies and we become more like Him. It's the only place in the world that you can do that.
This is one of my pet peeves. Probably not, you can put on here, Father Ryan's pet peeves, right? That will get the most views, I guarantee it, because they're like, well, pet peeves. I mean, maybe we do put it on there. I don't know. But one of my pet peeves is just just lack of obedience to the church. And you think, well, what are you talking about, Father Ryan? Obedience to the church? Well, I think a lot of people think they're obedient to the church, but they're not. They say they're obedient because maybe they're not out murdering people, but it's like, there's a lot more to being obedient than just that, like we talked about receiving. How do you receive communion? Are you obedient? The bishops say this is how you're supposed to receive, but so many people do it the way they want to do it. When it comes to marriage, people, the church has, okay, if you've been previously married, well, we have to go through the whole annulment process. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to go through the whole annulment process. I just want to get married to this person and forget that whole life that I had. And it's like, okay, well, the church has this process you have to go through. And people just like, no, I'm going to do my own thing. Well, I mean, that's obedience to the church. Throughout the scriptures, you're going to see that God constantly tests people on their faith and also their obedience, which I think in many ways goes hand to hand. Are you being faithful? Are you being obedient to the church and what the church is asking you to do? Father Corey's going to be vocations director, and there are some guys that feel like they have a right to be a priest. It's like, well, I want to be a priest, therefore I'm going to be a priest. And the church needs priests, so if I just raise my hand, then I'm in. And it's like, no, the church is who decides, whether or not you're going to be a priest. Now that comes from the bishop to the pastor to the people. Along that line, somebody might say, this guy's not really, I don't think this is what he's called to. And you have to accept that. And you can't just say, well, I'm going to do what I want to do. Again, that comes back to obedience. So I can, give you example after example of people that I think imagine that they're obedient, but when it comes to the teachings of the church, they're like, I'm going to do what I want to do. So they're not obedient. So again, it's whatever. I don't think it's maybe a pet peeve of mine, but it's maybe a better word would be like a frustration for me, is just to see people struggle with obedience. And again, I think it's a struggle for me because I've went through a lot of it myself. And it's like, I've learned that if I'm just obedient to the church, like life is a lot easier and things generally go a lot better. So I see that it's just like children, right? Again, being older now, you want to like help educate younger people. And when I say younger people, I mean teenagers, 20-somethings, 30, anybody younger than you. You can easily say, as the older people said with me, they would say, you need to take care of your knees. You need to eat healthier. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And you just say, whatever. And then when you get to be their age, you're like, oh yeah, well, that's why they said that. My knees hurt because I didn't take care of them, or I'm out of shape because I didn't eat right. So, as a priest, you see the same things when it comes to the faith. It's like, if you could just like try to, do what the church teaches you to do, your life's going to be much better. But again, we just decided to do whatever we want to do. And what happens is frustrations and challenges. And then they come back to us and they're like, why is this happening to me? And I'm like, looking at their life going, not obedient, not obedient, not obedient. And it would have been a lot easier if you'd have just done this X, Y, and Z along the way. But people just want to do what they want to do, which could go back to Adam and Eve and on down the line. So what's just frustrating as a pastor, again, just because so many times people come to you and it's just like, Well, and I'll even tell them what to do sometimes. They'll come to me with like, what do you think? And I'll say, this is what you need to do. Then they don't do it. And then they come back and go, well, that didn't work out. I'm like, crap, Part of it is like, not again, and I say this, I've said this in homilies, it's not like I have to be telling you how to live your life as pastor, but sometimes when you come to the pastor and then the pastor gives you advice, you should take the advice of the pastor. Like that might be God speaking to you. And oftentimes that's the way it works. You look at the lives of the saints, whether it's Saint Faustina or, God would tell them, Jesus would tell them, listen to your spiritual director, listen to your confessor, do what they tell you to do. So if you're coming to your pastor or your confessor or whoever, and they have some advice for you, and you don't like it, and so you ignore it and go do your own thing, don't expect it to work out very well. It generally doesn't. And I think sometimes God's like, okay, you want to be disobedient because God speaks to the church. It's like, it's not going to work out for you. It's the whole story of the Old Testament. Anytime you fall away from true worship of God, you fall away from being obedient, whatever the case may be, it always leads to destruction. So, yeah. It's not like we're telling people to do, if I give advice to anybody, it's always something, it's what the church teaches. I'm not giving people my advice, Father Ryan's advice. I think it's just like, somebody asks me a question, I'll lay out what the church teaches. Well, this is what the church teaches in this situation, and this is what you probably should do. So, but again, if they don't like it, they tend to do their own thing. So I've got lots of specific examples, but I'm not going to bring them up because they're parishioners of St. Joe and they'll know I'm talking about them. So we can't put that in there, but.